Good morning, students. I hope you're doing well as we enter week 3 of fall 2025. I am going to provide you in this video this week with some direct instruction in writing a specific kind of memo. So the research memo that we are working on for the first component of our job ad search packet, the job ad analysis. So let's get started on that. The thing I think I most want you to enter your composing process remembering is that this assignment asks you to analyze one text that is a genre, right? The job ad. So you're analyzing a job ad, but you're doing that, you're reporting out your analysis in a second genre, and that is the researched memo. So it's a lot to sort of balance metacognitively. So let's talk in this video about how you can approach this project. You remember that last week's lessons focused on the genre of the job ad. So for example, the parts of the ad, where you're going to locate the ad, and why these ads exist, that is how they function. And we also discussed last week rhetorical analysis as an intellectual activity. In other words, tactics that you use to analyze how a text impacts its reader so that you can make a judgment. Was that text a successful example of its genre, or did it fall short? So do you remember some of those tactics that we talked about last week and that you should be employing this week? I hope so, but just in case, remember that we talked about the components of the rhetorical situation, so you can analyze those as you do your job ad analysis. We analyzed parts of the job ad. We talked about looking for persuasive elements within that job ad. And then we talked about all the different strategies that job ads sometimes contain. So, for example, are they invoking authorities? The way that, for example, that Indiana University job ad did, that was in last week's video, where they were invoking, I think, U.S. News and World Reports or something like that to talk about how successful their academic programs had been. You can look at the way the ad's been arranged, the way the ad's been designed, the narrative, and sometimes those narratives are explicit, but sometimes they're implied. So is there a story being told about that company? Lingo, company culture for context, either within the ad or in your research that you do outside of looking at the job ad. Any rhetorical strategies that have been used to either widen or to narrow the audience. For example, the Fairfield job ad we looked at last week was for a part-time ad that allowed people with master's degrees only, but the Indiana University required the PhD, so it was more narrow. Okay, so we did all that last week, and hopefully you either have already been doing that or you're going to be doing that kind of rhetorical analysis for your first draft of the upcoming research memo, and that's going to also be located in your journal entry number 3. So, all that being said, now what I want to talk about is the genre that you yourself are composing, this researched memo. You may be very aware of what memos look like, but the thing is that these short memos are really a dying genre. And why? Because we have email now, right? And so most people aren't writing up a paper memo anymore. One of my very first jobs was working in a company where I was in their communications office. This was a long time ago. And we were always sending these very official hard copy memos like that. But now people aren't really doing that. They're just using email. And the research memo, though, does still have a place in organizational cultures, and it's because it's quite a bit different than those very short memos of the past. So let's talk about parts of research memos. It does still have this heading that comes from traditional uses. Often you'll have that title of memo or memorandum at the top. It has the to, the from, the date, and the subject. Sometimes instead of subject, that will say RE for in reference to or regarding. And then sometimes these are formatted with a line underneath, so it can look like that. Okay, that's what emails often look like too when you print those things out. And this is why they're coming from that traditional genre of memos. Okay, so those two areas. The next section of a memo is an opening section, and this is usually a paragraph and typically a really short paragraph. And it will include the purpose of the memo, the overall conclusion of the analysis that the memo is going to report, and then the basis for that conclusion. So, for example, look at this this first opening paragraph, and you see that they're underlined in red. The purpose of this memorandum is to provide you with some guidelines for writing effective memos. And you see that kind of language pretty common. So the purpose of this memo is, or in response to your request, this memo provides recommendations regarding. That's pretty typical for these research memos and the way they start off. The opening section also often includes a conclusion of your analysis, as I said, and the basis for that conclusion. So if you look at what's underlined there in red, the first sentence, market research and analysis show that the proposed advertising media for the new fall lines need to be reprioritized and changed. That's the conclusion of what all of the analysis that's going to be reported in the rest of this memo. It's going to provide analysis and evidence and discussion of. And then the basis, findings from focus groups and surveys. So that's where the evidence is coming from for that recommendation. Again, you can see first paragraph following this memo. Okay. Following typically is a context section, and these are wildly different. Sometimes a context section can be a single sentence. Sometimes it's a paragraph. Sometimes if the memo is very long or if the situation is very complicated, these context sections can stretch beyond that. So oftentimes things that are included are things like background of the situation that's being analyzed, specific circumstances that are impacting a current decision-making process, for example, a specific event that may be monumental within a given context, a problem that perhaps that you have been tasked to solve. And these context sections typically begin with a topic sentence. And so here I'm still on this same kind of marketing memo that I'm using here as an example. So you can see that the context here is in these first few sentences. It used to be common to advertise for our products on shows like Friends and Seinfeld for our target audience, but even the face of television is changing. Young adults are tuning into reality television shows for their entertainment. Results from the focus group show that our target audience is most interested in shows like Love is Blind, Project Runway, and Top Chef. So all of that is context, okay, for how the viewing habits of the target audience have changed. You know, the target buyer have changed. I want you to note a couple things here. In these memos, there are two values for how you write that are super important. First, you want absolute clarity. And I can tell you that one way that you're going to do that is being as specific as possible. So don't say here in this, if we look at this context section, it used to be common to advertise on television, right? Instead, we're hearing like, no, in these particular kinds of shows, these 30-minute sitcoms like Friends and Seinfeld. The second value that I want you to embrace in these memos is succinctness, right? You want to be as clear as possible. You want your language to be as on point as possible. So one of the things you have to balance as a writer that I think is particularly difficult in researched memos is developing fully enough, which can tend to lead to more words, more sentences, right? More evidence, versus also being succinct. And there is that pressure to get to the point, be as concrete as you can, use as few words as possible, have as short a memo as possible. So those are two values. Am I being clear? Am I being succinct? That you should come back to the entire time. Not even so much as you're writing, but as you're revising your memo and getting it ready for final submission. Parts of research memos, after you get the context down, you're moving on to specific task sections. And I say here, but I call these micro thesis sentences or thesis statements. We could also call these topic sentences, but the reason I don't is a topic sentence is typically for a single paragraph. Task sections might be a single paragraph, but they can also, depending on, again, the complicated nature of the task, the length of the memo, they can be multiple paragraphs sometimes. And so for each one of these task sections, you're going to want to think about having a micro thesis sentence. So let me point out here, I'm in the same memo that's about marketing again. And take a look. This social media advertising is a heading. And as the slide here points out, you want to use headings. These should be bolded. They're using the same font, same spacing, same font size. They'll be left margins, just like everything else. Here, this is all double spaced. If this were an all single spaced memo, it would be single spaced as well. But you'll see here that under this section of the memo that is only about social media advertising, there is this thesis sentence for this section. So XYZ company needs to focus advertising on social media applications that appeal to young people. Okay? And then the next thing is here you're reporting out these tasks that have been completed, oftentimes by you, but if not by others. So, for example, here we have this research. According to surveys, 72% of our target market uses social media for 40 hours or more per week. Okay. Note that that's followed by a bulleted list. Bulleted lists are super common in these memos as well. Again, because folk are trying to be clear, concrete, but also succinct. And then you often end up with a summary that includes a recommendation in this section. So, for example, shifting our efforts from other media sources such as radio and magazine to these social media applications will more effectively promote our product sales. Okay? So, here's what I'm saying we should do. Here is what's been done and why I can say that we should do that. And again, here's what we are going to get from this. Here's my recommendation. All right. I want to point out that the thing that comes next is probably the thing that's going to be the longest part of the memo. It's your actual discussion or analysis section. And let me also just go back and say one more thing. These task sections sometimes can bleed into the discussion and analysis. It sort of depends on the project that is being reported out about. So if you feel like, wow, having to include a task section and a discussion analysis section is making me repetitive in this memo, then I would delete this task section. But let me go on. So again, here with these discussion and analysis sections, you're starting with a thesis statement or topic sentence, and you're following that up with evidence. I'm switching here to a different memo. This is a memo that came about with a group of psychologists who were doing a large project together. And you see the thesis, I think all of that first little paragraph really is about thesis statements and or topic sentences for this section, this discussion or analysis section. And so they write the theme of managing heterosexism and that was one of the themes they were looking at in their research, this managing heterosexism. That it's emerging as a significant pattern across multiple participants' narratives. Many describe a constant awareness of potential homophobia and the need to actively strategize their behavior and self-presentation to avoid negative reactions. what they follow with then is evidence to support that statement. Why are their their burgeoning conclusions saying that this is a theme in the research? Well, here are two examples. They've interviewed Andreas and Asha, and they are reporting back what these folks have said during interviews. And so that's this evidence for this analytical conclusion that they are drawing. If you think about how is that going to apply to your research memo, I think your research memo for the job ad is going to have at least two large sections, and one's going to be your rhetorical analysis. For most of you, that's probably going to be limited to close textual analysis of the ad itself, along with some company and organization research. For others of you, you may add in some contextual analysis. And if you don't know what contextual analysis is, I covered that in my last video. It's near the end, so you can go back and rewatch that. Your second section is going to be your analysis of yourself as a candidate for that job. And again, go back, reread the instructions for the job ad analysis assignment. If you're now thinking, well, wait, I have to analyze myself. You do. It's part of the assignment. So go back and reread that. Okay. Next section of research memos is the action section where you suggest next steps. For your job ad, there are some action steps that are mandated that you include. And one is, what's your plan for becoming a desirable candidate for this job? And number two, what's your plan for composing the entire application? So the cover letter, that is the second component of this first major project, and then the resume, which is your final component of this first major project. And I think, too, you all are going to be in really different places. We have some students in my courses this semester who are first-year students. And so your plan for becoming a desirable candidate, you may want to talk a lot about the kind of courses you're going to take, what your choice of majors, how that's going to help you. For those of you who are graduating seniors this year, you may not be talking about that. You may be talking about an internship that you need to secure, or how you can talk about an internship that you had last year and leverage that into an application. This is a screenshot of the action items from that the psychologist memo I was just referring to, where they say that one thing they need to do is review the existing literature on compulsory heterosexuality, and then explore whether this theme of managing heterosexism might be reframed and even named as something differently, negotiating compulsory heterosexuality. So those are, their memo was really came in the middle of a research project, and so they're trying to figure out, well, where do we as a team go next? And well, first we need to read more in the literature, and we might need to think about renaming this category that we have been examining. Okay, last things, the closing section. This is typically really short. And sometimes this might be, I'm available to talk more about this in person. It might be, thank you for assigning this project to me, those kinds of things. Very short. And then memos can have attachments. So, for example, if you based a ton of your research on a specific data set, you could attach that data set so people could look at that. We're not doing a citation page for this project. I'm going to talk about that shortly. But sometimes, depending on the community that you're working within, citations are expected. And if you do that, then that would be an attachment, because citations are not typically included in these research memos. So if you include them, they're often an attachment. Okay, I'm going to pause. I'm going to invite you to pause. If there are any questions about that, I invite you to pause the video and put those questions in the Coffee House forum now, so that we have an opportunity to discuss those. So let me move on. And I'm now going to talk about citation modeling for these research memos. We are going to use APA style, but we're only going to use it for internal citation only. So we're going to tweak it just a little bit. So you will not include a reference page. And this means that you will have to provide the full information about a source within the body of the memo. So let me show you how to do this, because this is not quite typical APA style. So I want to provide you with some examples of this. So you're not going to do this. Employers list written communication skills as one of the most important factors in their hiring, AAC&U 2023. That might be the way you would include a citation if you were writing about this issue as an essay for a class, right? This is a digital source. So you would just have the author and the date there, no page number, right? You're not doing that because what that citation says to me is I don't know who that author is unless I go to your references page and look it up. But that reference page isn't going to be there. So instead, you would write it like this. According to the American Association of Colleges and Universities, that's the author. It's an organizational author. According to their prestigious It Takes More Than a Major, that's the title. Okay. And then I do have the date there, just in parentheses. Employers list written communication skills as one of the most important factors in hiring decisions. So that's all your language, but you're being very careful to make sure that your reader knows exactly where you're getting that information from, this prestigious author, this very prestigious report, and then the year that it came out. Okay, when you can, in a research memo, you should hyperlink. So let me give you an example where that happens. It is a myth that humanities majors earn lower salaries than pre-professional or professional majors, and all of this is hyperlinked, right? West Virginia University graduate director Shelley Quantz readily demonstrated in her 2017 blog post. So again, I've got the authority here, and I've got the year this came out. I don't need really the title of her blog post. That's not helpful and would be too long and not very succinct. And also I don't need it because I'm hyperlinking right to it. Okay. Let me provide you one other example. I think you're going to quote rarely in these research memos. And why do I make that suggestion? Got any ideas? I hope somebody just said because we want to be succinct, right? And so if you quote a whole lot, the memo's going to get unwieldy and quite large. But there may be a moment when you do need to quote something because it's just so important. And especially if you're doing rhetorical analysis, as these memos ask you to do, sometimes you need to quote directly in order to be specific. That's part of the evidence you're providing for why you are making the conclusions you are about the job ad, right? You're analyzing a text, and in order to prove your conclusions about that text, you often need to quote it. So you're going to include page numbers when they are available for all quotations and all paraphrases. Okay? So let me show you here how I want you to do that. So Joel Schwartzberg in 2025 decisively establishes in the Harvard Business Review. So again, I've got author, I've got date, I've got publication site, and then maybe as a writer, for some reason, I wanted to put all this in my memo. Submitting a thoughtful, personalized cover letter, whether the request is mandatory or optional, can significantly boost your chances of getting to the next stage in the application process and interview. 83% of hiring managers said they frequently or always read the cover letters they received. An astonishing 73% of the managers whose companies don't require cover letters still frequently read them. And then here, at the end of that, I'm going to put this page number in, parentheses, page number, period, 27, then the parentheses, and then the period here. Okay? If I was working with something, maybe I want to quote from my job ad and it came off Indeed, and there is no page number, then this would just be deleted. You would not have that. Okay? Any questions on that? Again, I invite you to pause the video and go and put those questions now in the Coffee House forum so we can talk about them. and I'll move on. I want to invite you now to pause the video and to practice on these specific bullet points. This is just a screen grab from our assignment instructions for the job ad analysis. And I invite you to kind of brainstorm three. If I were doing this, I would draw 3 columns on a piece of paper. I would have my ad in front of me, and I would start to have on my far left-hand column just the practical, factual information about the job that I'm going to want to talk about in my researched memo. In the middle, I would start to say, well, what's relevant information about this organization? Is it a company website? Is it a nonprofit's annual reports? Is it an internship program, social media presence? Like, what can I find in doing some research? And I would think, well, and what does that tell me about this organization? I would just brainstorm that in a middle column. And then on the right-hand side, after I've done those first 2 things, I might start to think, okay, now what can I kind of intuit when I go back and look at this ad again? What's implied in this ad? So I invite you to, everyone should just stop real quick and try to get at least a couple of things in each one of those columns, because this can go right into your first draft for your journal entry number 3. Okay, I'm going to assume you did that. And now I want to talk a little bit more about specifically this week's reading and how you can harness the ebb and flow of rhetoric, right? So all rhetoric, all communication arises from this great mass of ongoing stories, discussions, events. So rhetoric comes out of this ongoing conversation, and then it goes on to influence that context, right, by changing reality. And I don't know why, I always think of Swamp Thing, the DC Comics Swamp Thing, who, this, and so if you think about this ongoing, bubbling swamp of everybody in the world talking and communicating all the time, and then out of that bubbles up this one instance of rhetoric, in this case, this Swamp Thing. So let's tie that to what Grant Davies saying. He says, from this swamp of discourse, right, this ongoing conversation, that exigence is always there. And he asks 3 questions in terms of exigence. What's the rhetoric about? Why is it needed? And what should it accomplish? And I want to talk about each one of those very quickly with you. So I'm taking here, let me make sure you can see that. This is an honest to goodness job ad from Twitter. I'm trying to think when this came out, but 2020, I think. And they're advertising for a tweeter-in-chief. And you'll see here that you can work in San Francisco, New York, or any place that Twitter has an office in the country. And it starts off with a description of the ad, or the position rather. And I'm going to draw out this one. I could have done that for nearly any of these, but one of the things they say is that Twitter isn't like other brands. We're where all voices come together, where unique conversations happen every day. So put a pin in that, because we're going to come back to that. And then this is just the rest of the ad and the requirements. So you have to love Twitter, for example, in that first bullet point. And then one requirement is fun. We're going to come back to that too. Okay. So if we go back to Grant Davey, and he says, well, what's this rhetoric about? We could think of that job ad, right? What's the rhetoric in the job ad about? Things that we can ask are, what are the fundamental issues that are represented by any text? What values are at stake? So when this one swamp thing comes up out of the swamp of conversation, what values are at play in that one instance of communication? So, for example, for Twitter, one of the values was fun, right? But also there is the social media company reputation, right? That Twitter is a unique social media, or was, I guess I should say, was a unique social media figure, rhetor, really. in this great swamp of discourse. Grant Davy at one point says, a rhetor who can define the fundamental issues represented by a superficial subject matter and persuade audiences to engage those issues is in a position to maintain decisive control over the field of debate, which I think is when you are analyzing this ad, that company or organization who wrote that ad, that's what they're trying to do, is to maintain control over the rhetoric around this position. Then when you write your research memo, you're trying to maintain control over your audience, getting us to read that ad in a very particular way. Okay? So, for example, they talk about the distinctiveness of Twitter. You can look here at this. Twitter is what's happening in the world and what people are talking about right now. So it's omnipresent. It's distinctive. It's not, no one is saying that about Facebook or certainly like MySpace. That's, dead and gone. So the distinctiveness of Twitter is reiterated time and again in this ad. Okay. The other thing I want you to see is that rhetoric is oftentimes dealing with identity. And so, for example, there's often an identity of the organization, right? Twitter is distinctive. And then there is whoever's reading that rhetoric, their identity as audience members. And ultimately, what the rhetor wants to do is collapse those two things until they're one and the same, or at least until they overlap. So, again, Twitter isn't like other brands. We're where all voices come together. So everybody, right? It's omnipotent, where unique conversations happen every day. So it's timeless. It's every day, every person, right? So that's a move there where the writer of that ad is trying to get you as an audience member to identify with the organization. It's on trend. They're trying to seduce you into saying that would be the best company to work for. And you can decide whether or not, if they're persuasive. So, okay, let's go back to this one. The second question that we can ask, according to Grant Davy, when you're trying to actionize his concept, is why is this particular moment of discourse needed? And we can ask ourselves, why is it needed now? Some of you have probably heard of this ancient Greek concept, kairos. It's also been adopted by Jesuits too, in Jesuit pedagogy, but it just means like the perfect time for a perfect moment of communication, right? It reminds me a little bit of the McCarthy hearings, those of you who've taken American history, and the Red Scare, and Joseph McCarthy was, calling everyone who he claimed was a communist in to testify before Congress. And at one point, he was incredibly powerful. People were very afraid. And then finally, there's one moment in those hearings when someone talks back to him, right, and says, "Have you no shame, sir? Have you no shame?" And there was really an incredibly kairotic, they're like the adjective form, moment in history. So why does it matter? What are the implications of this particular moment? And then finally, Grant Davy says, what is it accomplishing? Like, if you're thinking about exigence, what's it accomplishing? So in other words, how's the audience supposed to react? And what's the objective? Now, I'm going to talk about those things, but I'm going to talk about them in relation to two other rhetorical concepts. I think when we look back to these earlier slides, that I think we can talk about these things in relation to audience and rhetor. Okay, so let's talk about those rhetors and audience members. One thing that's my phone ringing. Let me stop that. Sorry, guys. Who is the rhetor at this moment in this rhetorical situation? Now, what I mean by that is, first of all, literally who is the rhetor? So Twitter or Twitter's HR department. When you're writing your memo to me, but we want to go beyond the obvious here. So like, who are you in this moment, right? What authority do you have? What's your persona? What's the personality of the text? one thing you can think about is that we all play a range of rhetorical roles, um, so that you have to ask yourself, is there a transfer of ethos here? So imagine that you are on the lacrosse team and your goal is to go into lacrosse coaching as your profession, and you're looking at lacrosse coaching job ads. Well, you already have some ethos in one part of your life, as an athlete, that you can transfer in a positive way into this new rhetorical environment of this research letter, or research memo rather. So sometimes though that can be opposite, right? I mean, it reminds me, some of you who are football fans, Michael Vick went to jail for fighting dogs. And then after he came out of jail, one of the things he started to do was work with dog rescues. And that was, some people might think that that was good and showed remorse, and other people might think, hey, bud, no way. I remember you. And the ethos doesn't transfer quite in the way he hoped, right? The other thing is, who is the audience? Yeah, literally who is the audience, but this is going to be a wide group. So it might be folks who encounter the discourse, who were never targeted, but if something goes viral and now they're part of the audience. It can be folk who are actually in a rhetorical situation. So maybe all those employees at Twitter right now when that ad went out. It can be folk that the rhetor intentionally addressed. So maybe, communications graduates who really did love Twitter at the time and really did think that it was the most relevant social media platform. It can be folk that the rhetoric seems to suggest. So let me show you an example. So this is again, a screen grab of the actual ad, right? The title, Tweeter in Chief. Again, this was around 2020. And then this is a screen grab from CNN around that same time. And people started to call President Trump the tweeter in chief during his first term because he tweeted so often. So there is a parallel here. And Twitter may have done that very consciously and wanted to attract people and sort of build on the cachet of that phrase. On the other hand, they may not have wanted to do that, and some folks who felt different politically than President Trump may have been less likely, right, to apply for that job. One thing to think about is, how does your anticipation of a specific audience lead you to create yourself as a specific rhetor in any given moment? Go back to when you wrote the email to me and the introduction of yourself on the discussion forum. At the beginning of the semester. How did your anticipation of your audience cause you to write differently? Another way of looking at this is when you are an audience member, how does a rhetor, so in this case we can say the job ad writer, invite you as an audience member to create a new identity for yourself? And one thing that's relevant here is publication site. So how does a publication site suggest who the rhetor and who the audience members are? And when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about, this is about 10 years ago, maybe a little more than that now. Queensland had a job ad that they largely posted digitally in a huge number of sites around the world. And it was for a 6-month contract to basically be an island caretaker, and they said it was the best job in the world. It was 150 Australian dollars, and the idea there was that you were going to live alone on this protected space on this island. The guy who did that I know he kayaked around the whole of the Great Barrier Reef or something like that, and so you can Google him and find out more about that. But the idea here with this ad especially was it was inviting audience members to imagine a life that they had never considered before and become a caretaker of an island. Okay. One more thing I want to talk about, and that is constraints. And one thing I really like about Grant Davey is we typically think of constraints as a problem. They're negative, they're obstacles. So think about those two ads we looked at last week. one for the adjunct ad at Fairfield and one for the full-time ad at Indiana University. The one obstacle that could be negative for most folks applying for that adjunct ad is that it's not full-time, right? And there's no way to get around that. It's just a negative constraint for most people. A positive constraint would be something like you're going to supervise maybe a team of people. And so, like, yeah, you got to supervise these people, but wow, you have a whole team. So that's sort of thinking about that in a positive way. Somebody who really does best working alone and in isolation, that's going to be a negative constraint for them. But for lots of people, they're going to find community, right, in that. So I'm thinking, I'm on the swamp metaphor today. That's a blue heron in the swamp. But you think about all these things that are in the swamp, right? So here we have very pretty, it's a bird, but like, is that a rock or is that an alligator? We don't know, right? So, but there are always going to be constraints, right? There are always going to be the alligators and the water lilies, okay? So let's think about examples that are not metaphorical here, that you can think about is what are the genre norms and the rhetorical norms? And again, how are those going to be negatively constraining to you? But how are they positive in that you can build on the genre norms or rhetorical norms? Cultural beliefs and values, like what would be, a common belief that you feel like you could invoke versus what is one that puts you on thin ice. The timing, events, the current context, what in those categories are negative and you have to get past versus positive. Traditions, what are traditions, history, precedents, norms, cultural mores that, again, constrain versus give you something to build on. Authorities, policies, laws, judgments, and these just go on and on and on. And at one point, Grant Davy says there are too many to list, and he's right about that. So, but these are the kinds of things, these categories, I offer them up not as a summative list, but really just as to get you thinking. What is relevant in your analysis and that you can build on in your research memo? Okay, here's the big takeaway this week. The obvious should not be your end point in these job ad analysis, right? So, like, for real, if you don't remember anything else about this video, the obvious should not be your endpoint. So if all you're writing in your job ad analysis research memo is what the desired qualifications are and what you're getting your degree in, you haven't really succeeded. These are concepts, they're tools that help you to analyze a rhetorical situation and to do it from various perspectives. Okay, we're all guilty of being inside our own skin. And so you want to sort of analyze this from multiple perspectives and try to figure out how and why is the rhetoric functioning as it is? Is it successful? Why or why not? And then how can you respond successfully to it? None of these concepts are going to work if you just remember them as definitions and could, parrot them back to me on an exam. They only work if you use them and it's part of your analysis and your writing process. Okay, so again, all questions go into the coffee house, and you can reach out to me with any individual issues you might be having as a student. But as always, I thank you for your kind attention, and I'm looking forward to seeing your first drafts that will be part of Journal 3. Okay, thank you, everybody. Be well.